You look like you're planning my funeral.
Only deciding whether to bury you in London or the countryside, Your Grace.
Good God.
Sharp, metallic regret already flooded Arvand's mouth, tasting like blood from a bitten lip, even before the ink on the parish registry had dried. Marrying the woman known as the Hayes spinster was supposed to be a life sentence, won in a drunken wager. But, as she unpinned her hair in his cold, quiet bedroom, he realized the joke was abruptly and violently on him. The carriage smelled of damp wool and stale gin. Arvand pressed the heel of his hand against his temple, trying to crush the dull, rhythmic throb blooming behind his right eye. Rain lashed against the glass in aggressive, diagonal sheets, blurring the soot-stained bricks of Mayfair into a watery gray smear. Across from him sat his wife. The word felt like a stone lodged in his throat. Isabella. Isabella Hayes. No, Isabella Cavendish, Duchess of Rothesay. She was staring out the window, her profile sharp and unmoving against the bleak afternoon light. She wore a slate-colored traveling gown that had seen at least 3 winters, the velvet trim at the cuffs rubbed entirely bald. She hadn't cried during the hastily arranged ceremony at St. George's. She hadn't trembled when he slid the heavy gold band procured from his solicitor's safe just an hour prior onto her finger. Her skin had been freezing, her knuckles slightly red from the London chill. Arvand let his head fall back against the leather squabs. God, he was an idiot. The memory of Tuesday night at White's Club rose in his stomach like bile. The smoke hanging thick in the air, the clink of crystal, the roar of laughter, from men who had too much money and not enough purpose. Lord Worthington, flush with brandy and spite, slamming his hand on the baize table. You think you're untouchable, Rothesay. Untethered. I wager 1,000 guineas you wouldn't survive a week, chained to the Hayes spinster. She'd freeze the blood in your veins before the honeymoon was over. Arvand hadn't taken the bet out of a need for the money. He took it out of a corrosive, hollow boredom, and because he despised Worthington. The idea of taking the ugliest joke in London society, the perpetual wallflower, the impoverished, sharp-tongued daughter of a disgraced baron, and elevating her above all the simpering debutantes had felt, in the drunken haze of the moment, like a brilliant act of vandalism. Now, sober, the vandalism was his own life. The carriage jolted over a cobblestone, snapping Arvand's teeth together. Isabella didn't flinch. She just kept staring at the rain. You are remarkably quiet, Arvand said. His voice was rough, scraping against the silence, given the circumstances. Isabella turned her head slowly. Her eyes were a flat, unreadable hazel. Not beautiful, too observant to be beautiful. There were faint, bruised shadows beneath them, speaking of sleepless nights and quiet anxieties. Would you prefer I scream, Your Grace? Her voice was entirely devoid of inflection. It wasn't a challenge. It was a genuine inquiry. I can, if it would make you feel more like a victor. Though, I imagine my lungs would give out before we reach your townhouse. Arvand scowled, shifting his weight. I don't require hysterics. Good, because I am very tired, and hysterics require energy. She turned her gaze back to the window. I assume my father's debts have been settled. As of this morning. Then the transaction is complete. She said it with a finality that made Arvand's chest tighten. She was rubbing her thumb over the side of her index finger. A small, rhythmic friction. It was the only sign that she was alive, that she wasn't just a statue carved from chalk and old grievances. When the carriage finally ground to a halt before the imposing limestone facade of Rothesay House, the rain had settled into a miserable drizzle. The footman pulled the door open, his eyes widening slightly as he took in the plain, severe woman stepping out unassisted. Arvand followed, his boots splashing into a puddle he was too tired to avoid. The entrance hall was cavernous, drafty, and smelled faintly of beeswax and old wood. The staff was lined up, hastily assembled by the butler, Hastings, whose neutral expression was a masterpiece of professional repression. "Welcome home, Your Grace," Hastings said, bowing. He did not look at Isabella. "This is the new Duchess," Arvand said, stripping off his wet gloves and tossing them onto a silver tray. The words sounded absurd, echoing off the marble. "Show her to the East Wing. Have a fire lit." He didn't look at her. He couldn't. He turned toward his study, desperate for the familiar burn of scotch, desperate to drown out the reality of the frail-looking woman standing in his hall. "Arvand," he stopped, his hand on the brass doorknob. No one called him Arvand, not even his mistresses. He looked back over his shoulder. Isabella was standing at the base of the grand staircase, a small, battered, leather valise clutched in her hand. She looked incredibly small against the sweeping mahogany banister, but her chin was tipped up. "I prefer the West Wing," she said. "The East Wing catches the morning sun, and I have no desire to wake early." Hastings froze. A footman swallowed audibly. Arvand stared at her. The audacity of it scraped against his exhausted nerves. She was a punchline. She was supposed to scurry into the shadows, grateful for a roof. "The West Wing," Arvand said slowly, "is under renovation. It smells of paint." "I prefer paint to dawn," Isabella replied instantly. She didn't blink. A sudden, sharp laugh punched its way out of Arvand's chest before he could stop it. It was a harsh, ugly sound. "Fine. Put her in the West Wing, Hastings. Let her choke on the fumes." He slammed the study door behind him, the heavy thud rattling the frames of his ancestors on the walls. He walked straight to the decanter, his hands shaking slightly as he poured amber liquid into a crystal tumbler. He drank it neat, closing his eyes as it burned a path down his throat. He had expected a victim. He had expected tears, or pathetic gratitude, or the cloying desperation of a woman suddenly handed a title. Instead, he had bought a feral cat and locked it in his house. By 8 o'clock, the storm outside had escalated, rattling the tall, mullioned windows of the dining room. The room was oppressively large, designed to seat 40, but tonight it was set for 2, at the very end of the mahogany table. Arvand sat at the head, swirling a glass of dark claret. He wore a fresh cravat and a dark evening coat, though the effort felt ridiculous. He had spent the afternoon avoiding the house entirely, retreating to his stables, then to the library, pacing like a caged animal. The doors opened, and Isabella walked in. Arvand paused, the rim of the glass resting against his lower lip. She hadn't changed into a gown fitting a duchess. She likely didn't own one. She wore a dark green wool dress, high at the collar, severely lacking in any lace or adornment, but she had washed her face. Her dark hair was pulled back tightly, but a few damp tendrils escaped at the nape of her neck. She took her seat at his right, without waiting for him to stand. A footman approached, silently ladling a clear, fragrant broth into her bowl. The smell of roasted thyme and rich beef marrow filled the space between them. For 10 minutes, the only sounds were the scrape of silver spoons against porcelain and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Arvand found himself watching her hands. They were unadorned, save for his gold ring, and marred by a faint, purplish stain on the middle finger of her right hand. Ink. "Are you going to stare at me all evening? Or are we going to discuss the elephant that has taken up residence on the table?" she asked, setting her spoon down. Arvand raised an eyebrow. "I wasn't aware there was an elephant." "Don't be tedious," Isabella said, taking a sip of water. "I know why I am here." Arvand felt a sudden, unpleasant drop in his stomach. He set his wine down. "Do you?" "My father is a fool who owes money to men who do not accept apologies as currency," she said smoothly, picking up her knife, as the next course, a thick cut of venison, was placed before her. "You are a man who enjoys proving a point. I imagine the point involved Lord Worthington, given that he cornered my father last week and laughed in his face about a wager." Arvand's jaw tightened. "Worthington talks too much," Worthington is an ass, Isabella corrected, cutting a neat square of meat. But he is a loud ass. So, tell me, Your Grace, what was the exact phrasing of the dare, and how much was I worth? Arvand felt a flush of genuine shame, a sensation so rare it felt like an illness. He looked at the woman sitting across from him. She wasn't trembling. She was eating her venison with methodical precision. 1,000 guineas, Arvand said, his voice dropping an octave. That I wouldn't marry you and last a week without losing my mind. Isabella paused, her fork halfway to her mouth. She stared at him, and then, very slowly, a smirk curled the corner of her lips. It changed her entire face. It pulled the tired shadows away and revealed something sharp, wicked, and entirely unexpected. 1,000, she asked. You were robbed. You could have had me for 300 in a decent carriage. Arvand let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. You aren't angry. Angry? Isabella put her fork down, leaning back in her chair. The candlelight caught the hollow of her throat. My father was going to sell me to a 60-year-old baron in Yorkshire who smelled of boiled cabbage and had buried 3 wives. Instead, I am in Mayfair, eating excellent venison, married to a man who will likely ignore me for the rest of his life. I consider the 1,000 guineas a bargain for us both. She was entirely pragmatic. It was jarring. I am not going to ignore you, Arvand said. The words slipped out before he could filter them. Isabella looked at him, her hazel eyes narrowing slightly. Yes, you will. You will go back to your clubs and your mistresses and your gambling, and I will remain here. I require a generous allowance for books, access to the library, and a lock on my bedroom door. In return, I will not humiliate you in public. I will run your household with brutal efficiency, and I will ensure Lord Worthington looks like a fool. Those are my terms. Arvand stared at her, the sheer, unadulterated gall of it. She was laying down terms. The punishment was negotiating. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, suddenly hyper-aware of the space between them. A lock on your door? To keep the staff out, Isabella said evenly, though a faint flush crept up her neck. And to keep you out, should you decide you want to play the role of a dutiful husband. I am not part of the wager's physical requirements, I assume. There were no physical requirements, Arvand said, his voice low, scraping against the quiet of the room. He watched the pulse flutter rapidly at the base of her throat. She was terrified. She was hiding it behind a wall of ice and intellect, but she was terrified of him. The realization didn't make him feel powerful. It made him feel like a monster. He stood up suddenly, his chair scraping loudly against the wooden floorboards. Isabella flinched, a tiny, involuntary flinch that hit Arvand like a physical blow. You may have your lock, Arvand said, looking down at her. He didn't mask the self-disgust in his tone. You may have the library. You may have the entire damned house. He turned and walked toward the doors. Where are you going? She asked, her voice faltering just a fraction. To White's, Arvand lied. He didn't want to go to the club. He knew Worthington and the rest of the vultures would be waiting there, expecting him to walk in looking miserable, expecting him to complain about the shrew he was saddled with. Instead, Arvand walked out of the dining room, crossed the grand hall, and went straight into his study. He poured another drink, sat in the dark leather chair by the unlit hearth, and listened. For an hour, he heard nothing. Then, the soft, hesitant footsteps of his wife moving up the stairs. Arvand closed his eyes. The scent of her, something like old paper and sharp lavender, seemed to linger in the hallway outside. He had married her as a joke. A brutal, cynical joke to win a petty war among arrogant men. But as he sat in the dark, listening to the faint, metallic click of the lock turning on the west wing bedroom door, Arvand realized the terrifying truth. He didn't want to be at his club. He wanted to be on the other side of that door. For 3 days, Rothesay House existed in a state of suspended animation. The servants walked with muted footsteps, bracing for a detonation that never came. Arvand did not go to his club. He did not call upon his mistresses, whose perfumed notes piled up unread on his silver salver. Instead, he haunted his own home like a displaced ghost. He woke late, drank strong, bitter coffee, and listened. He listened for the rustle of dark green wool. He listened for the sharp, precise clip of Isabella's boots on the floorboards. He found her on Thursday afternoon in the library. The room was vast, a 2-story cavern of mahogany and dust. The air here was heavy, smelling of decaying leather binding, dried ink, and the faint, citrus tang of lemon oil used by the maids. Isabella was sitting at the massive partner's desk, bathed in a slanted shaft of pale afternoon sunlight. Arvand stopped in the doorway. She was entirely unaware of him. She had pushed her sleeves up past her elbows, revealing pale, slender forearms. A smudge of ink marked her cheekbone, stark against her skin. She was surrounded by towering stacks of leather-bound books, not poetry, not romances, ledgers. "What are you doing?" Arvand asked, his voice rougher than he intended. It broke the silence like a dropped plate. Isabella didn't jump. She finished running her finger down a column of numbers, dipped her quill into a brass inkwell, and made a sharp notation in the margin before looking up. "I told you I would run your household with brutal efficiency," she said. Her voice was calm, but the hazel of her eyes was flinty. "I am beginning with your estate manager in Cornwall. He is robbing you, by the way." Arvand crossed the room, his boots heavy on the Persian rug. He came to a stop at the edge of the desk, looking down at the frantic sea of numbers. "Robbing me. Systematically, and with a shocking lack of imagination," Isabella replied, leaning back in the heavy leather chair. It swallowed her small frame, yet she looked entirely in command. "He has been inflating the cost of grain seed by nearly 12% for the last 4 years, funneling the surplus into a secondary account. It's buried in the tenant repairs, but the math is sloppy." Arvand stared at her. He felt a strange, tight sensation in his chest. It wasn't anger. It was a terrifying, electric jolt of fascination. He had spent his life surrounded by women who feigned ignorance to make him feel powerful. Isabella was sitting in his chair, casually dismantling his staff and making him feel entirely, wonderfully, off balance. "You read estate ledgers," Arvand said slowly. "My father was a ruinous gambler," she said, looking back at the paper. The muscle in her jaw tightened, a fleeting betrayal of the composure she wore like armor. "Someone had to know how much time we had before the creditors arrived. I learned to read a balance sheet before I learned to embroider." She reached for a piece of blotting paper. As she did, the fraying cuff of her sleeve caught on the brass inkwell. Arvand reached out instinctively. His large, warm hand closed over her wrist to steady it. Isabella froze. The silence in the library rushed back in, thick and suffocating. Arvand didn't let go. Beneath his thumb, he could feel the frantic, fluttering beat of her pulse. Her skin was cool, the bone structure delicate, like a bird's wing. He looked at her face. Her lips were parted slightly, her breath caught in her throat. The sharp, guarded woman was gone, replaced by someone acutely vulnerable. He didn't want to break her. He wanted, with a sudden, violent intensity, to protect her. From Worthington, from her father, from himself. "Your Grace," the butler intoned, "Lord Worthington is called. He is insisting on paying his respects to the newlywed couple." Arvand dropped Isabella's wrist as if he had been burned. A cold, black rage spiked in his blood. Worthington couldn't wait. He wanted to see the misery. He wanted to gloat over the spinster and the trapped Duke. "Tell him I am out," Arvand snarled, already moving toward the door. "Tell him to go to hell." "No." Arvand stopped, turning back. Isabella was standing. She was pulling her sleeves down, smoothing the worn fabric with meticulous care. The vulnerability was gone, buried beneath a fresh layer of frost. "Tell Lord Worthington we will receive him in the drawing room, Hastings. Isabella said. Hastings looked at Arvand, seeking permission. Arvand's jaw clenched. You do not have to do this, Isabella. I won't have him parade you like a trophy of his own cleverness. Isabella walked around the desk. She stopped inches from him. She smelled of lavender and old paper. You bought a wife to win a wager, Arvand. If we hide, he wins. If he sees me in this frayed dress, cowering in a library, he wins. She looked up, her eyes locking onto his. I do not lose to men like Worthington. The drawing room was stifling. Arvand stood by the marble fireplace, his arm resting on the mantel, every muscle in his back coiled tighter than a watch spring. Worthington sat on the velvet settee, a glass of Arvand's best brandy resting on his knee. He smelled cloyingly of bergamot pomade and smug satisfaction. He wore a waistcoat of aggressive mustard silk, his ruddy face split in a wide, carnivorous grin. I must admit, Rothesay, I didn't think you had the stomach for it, Worthington crowed, taking a sip of the brandy. When the registry notice was published, I thought it was a misprint. The Hayes spinster. A bold choice for a man who usually prefers his company, ornamental. Arvand's fingers tightened on the edge of the mantel. He imagined the sickening crunch of Worthington's nose cartilage under his knuckles. It was a beautiful thought. My wife, Arvand said, the word tasting surprisingly right on his tongue, is resting. A pity, Worthington sighed with exaggerated disappointment. I brought her a wedding gift, a mirror. I thought perhaps she hadn't looked in one recently, given her usual parlor attire. She has no need of it. The voice came from the doorway. Arvand turned, and the breath vanished from his lungs. Isabella stood on the threshold. Gone was the frayed green wool. In its place was a gown of midnight blue silk. It wasn't heavily embroidered or weighed down by lace. It was stark, architectural, and ruthlessly elegant, cut to emphasize the long, graceful line of her neck and the narrowness of her waist. Arvand had sent a modiste to the West Wing yesterday morning, ordering a wardrobe fit for a duchess, expecting Isabella to reject it. She hadn't. She had weaponized it. Her dark hair was swept up in a severe, intricate knot, pinned with small sapphire combs that caught the firelight. She did not look like a simpering debutante. She looked like a queen stepping onto a battlefield. Worthington scrambled to his feet, brandy sloshing over the rim of his glass onto his mustard waistcoat. He stared, his mouth slightly open. The joke of London society was staring back at him with an expression of profound, chilling boredom. Lord Worthington, Isabella said, her voice gliding across the room like silk over glass. She did not offer her hand. She walked to the armchair opposite him and sat with terrifying grace. How kind of you to call, though I am surprised to see you in Mayfair. I had heard your tailor placed a lien on your carriage horses. Arvand choked on a sudden bark of laughter, turning it into a cough against his fist. Worthington's ruddy face turned a mottled, furious purple. That is an outrageous rumor, Your Grace. Is it? Isabella tilted her head, her gaze sweeping over his stained waistcoat. My apologies. I merely assumed, given the desperate nature of your recent wagers, that liquidity was an issue. One only bets 1,000 guineas on another man's life when one is struggling to afford one's own. Worthington gaped like a fish pulled onto a dock. He looked at Arvand for rescue. Arvand pushed off the mantelpiece and walked to stand behind Isabella's chair. He didn't say a word. He simply rested his hand on the high, carved back of her seat, his thumb lightly brushing the silk at her shoulder. It was a quiet, absolute declaration of possession and alliance. I came to offer my congratulations, Worthington sputtered, trying to recover his footing, to see how the punishment was suiting the Duke. Arvand felt the tension in Isabella's shoulder. She was waiting for him to agree, waiting for him to laugh with his peer. Arvand looked at Worthington, his expression deadening into something cold and predatory. Punishment. Arvand asked softly. He moved around the chair, stepping between Worthington and his wife. He looked down at Isabella. The firelight flickered in her hazel eyes, illuminating a raw, hidden fear that she was about to be the punchline again. Arvand reached down and took her hand. He pulled her up, his grip firm and warm. She stood, her chest rising in a sharp breath as he pressed her knuckles to his mouth. He didn't just brush his lips against the skin. He lingered, his eyes locked on hers, feeling the frantic pulse at her wrist settle into a heavy, rhythmic thud. He turned back to Worthington, keeping Isabella's hand secured in his. "You did me a favor, Worthington," Arvand said, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "You were right. I was untethered, bored. I spent my days with men who have nothing between their ears but the echoes of their father's accomplishments. And then you dared me to look at the smartest, sharpest woman in London." Arvand smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Every man in my club will know by tomorrow that I won the wager. But more importantly, they will know that while they are married to girls who weep over torn ribbons, I am married to a duchess who could ruin them before breakfast. Get out of my house, Worthington, before my wife decides to audit your estate next." Worthington didn't speak. He set his glass on a side table with a trembling hand, gave a jerky, uncoordinated bow, and practically ran for the oak doors. The heavy slam of the front door echoed through the manor a minute later. Silence rushed back into the drawing room, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Arvand slowly released Isabella's hand. He felt stripped bare, his own cynicism burned away by the adrenaline of the encounter. Isabella was staring at him. Her armor was cracking. The icy composure had melted, leaving her looking bewildered, angry, and achingly beautiful. "Why did you do that?" she whispered. "Because it is the truth," Arvand said, his voice ragged. "I married a joke to spite a fool, and I woke up to find I had married the only real thing in my life." Isabella took a step back, her chest heaving. Don't play games with me, Arvand. I can survive your neglect. I cannot survive your pity." "It isn't pity," he said, stepping toward her. The scent of her lavender and rain was intoxicating. "It's terror. You terrify me, Isabella, because you don't need me. You need my library and a lock on your door." She swallowed hard, looking away, staring at the embers in the hearth. "I am tired, Your Grace. I am going to my room." She brushed past him. Arvand let her go. He watched the midnight blue silk drag across the Persian rug, listening to the hurried rhythm of her footsteps as she practically fled the room. He poured himself a drink he didn't want. He stared at the fire until the logs broke down into glowing ash. The house grew utterly silent, the servants having long since retired. Finally, Arvand set his glass down. He walked out of the drawing room and climbed the grand staircase. He turned down the west wing corridor. It smelled faintly of fresh paint, just as he had warned her. He stopped in front of her door. He didn't raise his hand to knock. He knew the terms of their bargain. He knew the parameters of her survival. She had built walls to keep the world out, and he had helped lay the bricks. He leaned his forehead against the cool wood of the door, closing his eyes, listening to the heavy silence on the other side. He was a duke. He was a man who took what he wanted, broke what he pleased, and bought his way out of the consequences. But standing in the dark hallway, Arvand realized the only thing he wanted in the world was something he could not take. It had to be given. He took a slow, shuddering breath, preparing to turn away, preparing for a long, cold night in the east wing. Then he heard it, a soft, metallic scrape, the heavy slide of a brass bolt. Click, the lock disengaged. Arvand opened his eyes. The door didn't open. It just sat there, unlocked, the barrier removed, an invitation wrapped in a terrifying leap of faith. Arvand's hand trembled as he reached for the brass knob. He turned it and stepped into the dark. If you felt the heat of that unlocking door and the crackle of Arvand and Isabella's undeniable tension, don't let the story end here. Hit that like button to show your love for historical romance that breaks the mold. Share this video with a friend who loves a fierce, quick-witted heroine and a duke brought to his knees. And make sure to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss our next steamy, grounded storytelling adventure.